September 5, 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt walked through the doors of his former headquarters for the first time in 2 months. The building hadn't changed. The maps were still there, the desks, the silence, but the war had changed completely. Rundstedt had been dismissed in July for telling Hitler's staff the truth that Normandy was lost, that Germany could no longer win in the West. That peace was the only rational option. Now Hitler was calling him back. That alone told him how bad things had become. Waiting for him was General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff for German forces in the West. The maps were already laid out. They didn't need explanation. Allied armies had broken out of Normandy 6 weeks earlier. They weren't advancing. They were flooding across France. Paris was gone. Most of the country was gone. American and British forces were racing east faster than German planners had believed physically possible. Blumentritt pointed south. Patton's Third Army. In just 3 weeks, it had advanced over 400 miles. Its forward units were now less than 100 miles from Germany itself. Rundstedt studied the map. Then he asked the question he already knew the answer to. What do we have to stop him with? Blumentritt didn't hesitate. Nothing. What the German High Command was facing in early September 1944 wasn't a retreat in any conventional military sense. Retreats are planned. They have rear guards, fallback positions, and orders that still mean something. What Germany was experiencing in the West was something far worse. It was a collapse between General George S. Patton's fast-moving spearheads and the German border. There were no intact fighting formations left. Not one. The divisions that had battled the Allies across France only weeks earlier no longer existed as cohesive units. They were shattered into fragments, company-sized remnants drifting eastward without orders, without leadership, and often without weapons. Heavy artillery had been abandoned in Giz. Tanks sat burned out along roadsides, their fuel long gone. Radios were silent, either destroyed or useless, leaving commanders blind and isolated. In many sectors, command had simply ceased to function. On maps in Berlin, Germany still possessed defenses. On paper, the Siegfried Line, the mighty West Wall, stood as a concrete barrier protecting the Reich. In reality, it was a hollow myth. Its bunkers were empty shells. Many had no doors, no wiring, no crews. The guns that were supposed to man them had been sent east years earlier to fight the Red Army and were never replaced. What remained was concrete without soldiers, fortifications without firepower. German officers later described the retreat not as a military withdrawal, but as a scene of pure panic. Roads clogged with burning trucks and overturned wagons. Columns dissolved into chaos as Allied fighter bombers prowled overhead. Men threw away rifles, helmets, even boots, anything that slowed them down. Discipline vanished. Survival replaced duty. This wasn't a defeat. It was humiliation. Post-war interrogations would reveal just how fragile Germany's position truly was at that moment. On September 1, 1944, the entire Western Front, the last shield between the Allies and the German heartland, possessed the effective combat strength of barely a dozen divisions. And even those were divisions in name only, under strength, exhausted, poorly equipped, and often composed of hastily assembled replacements with little training. Facing them was Patton's Third Army alone, 12 full-strength American divisions, bristling with armor, supported by overwhelming artillery and enjoying complete air superiority. Patton's forces were not exhausted, they were aggressive, confident, and moving faster than German intelligence believed possible. Fuel shortages slowed them, but enemy resistance did not, even worse for Germany. There was nothing behind the line. No reserves. No panzer divisions waiting to counterattack. None is moving into position. None forming in the rear. The armored forces that might once have slammed into Patton's flanks simply did not exist anymore. They had been destroyed in Normandy, burned up in France, or bled white on the Eastern Front. If Patton broke through, and he was already doing so, there was nothing left to stop him. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander in the West, understood the situation with terrifying clarity. This was not pessimism. It was mathematics. He reported the truth directly to Hitler's headquarters. If the Americans were allowed to continue their advance, the Rhine would be reached and crossed within 2 weeks. The war could end in the West before winter even arrived. Hitler's response was chilling in its simplicity. There were no reinforcements, no divisions to send, no tanks to spare, no miracle waiting in reserve. Do what you can. It was not an order. It was an admission. For a brief, extraordinary moment in September 1944, the road to Germany lay wide open, unguarded, undefended, and exposed. And the fate of the Third Reich hung on whether the Allies would realize just how close total victory truly was. Then something happened that German commanders could not understand. Something so unexpected that many initially refused to believe it. Patton stopped. In early September 1944, the relentless momentum of the U.S. Third Army began to slow. At first, it was barely noticeable, an armored column pausing longer than expected, an infantry regiment waiting a few extra hours before moving forward. Then the pauses grew longer. Entire divisions that had been racing across France, covering dozens of miles a day, suddenly sat idle along dusty roads in captured towns. Engines were shut off. Maps stayed folded. Orders to advance never came, for the Germans watching from the other side. This made no sense at all. Patton had been the embodiment of unstoppable force. His tanks had smashed through shattered German lines, his troops moving so fast that German headquarters often learned of breakthroughs hours after they had already happened. Now, without warning, the spearhead froze in place. German intelligence officers scrambled for explanations. Their first conclusion was deception. This had to be a trick. Patton was famous for misdirection. Surely this pause was deliberate, an elaborate feint designed to lure German forces into a trap. Perhaps the real blow would fall farther north. Or maybe Patton was preparing a massive armored thrust that would resume at any moment, but the blow never came. Days passed. Then more days. The Americans did not surge forward. They did not shift direction. They simply waited. The truth, when it slowly became clear, was almost impossible for German commanders to accept. The Americans were out of fuel. The greatest armored advance in U.S. Army history had been brought to a halt not by enemy resistance, but by logistics. Patton's tanks had outrun their supply lines. Fuel trucks were stuck hundreds of miles behind, competing with every other Allied army for gasoline that simply did not exist in sufficient quantity. The ports needed to sustain the advance were still damaged. The rail networks were shattered. Every gallon had to come by truck from Normandy. Along roads already clogged with traffic for Patton's soldiers, the sudden stillness was maddening. They could see the open road ahead. German positions were thin or non-existent. Prisoners spoke openly of chaos in the rear. Civilians confirmed that there were no organized defenses waiting ahead. Yet day after day, the order was the same. Hold position. Save fuel. Wait. Tanks sat with empty fuel gauges. Some crews siphoned gasoline from abandoned vehicles just to reposition a few yards. Infantry units bivouacked in villages they had expected to pass through in hours, not days. The war, which had felt breathless and inevitable, suddenly stalled. German officers later described this moment in almost spiritual terms. It felt unreal. Like a reprieve from execution. Like a miracle. For weeks, they had lived with the certainty that disaster was imminent. Every morning brought the expectation that American armor would appear on the horizon, that the Rhine would be lost, that Germany itself would be breached before defenses could be rebuilt. Then, without warning, the pressure lifted. The roar of engines faded. The advance stopped. Time precious, irreplaceable time returned to the Germans. They used it desperately. Ad hoc units were scraped together from training schools, convalescent depots, and shattered formations. Engineers rushed to repair sections of the Siegfried Line. Volksgrenadier divisions began to form in name, if not in strength. Officers who had expected annihilation were suddenly handed a second chance. None of this should have been possible, and yet it was, for American soldiers at the front. The silence was worse than combat. Combat at least had purpose. Movement meant progress. Stillness meant uncertainty. They knew they were winning. They could feel it. The enemy was broken, retreating, afraid. Victory seemed close enough to touch, and yet they could not move. Patton himself fumed. He raged against the delays, demanded fuel, pleaded his case up the chain of command. But the decision had already been made. Resources were being diverted elsewhere. Other Allied armies had priority. The war would be won carefully. Methodically, not in the reckless dash Patton believed was. Possible. History would debate that. Choice for decades. In that brief window, those critical days in early September 1944, the outcome of the war in the West balanced on logistics rather than bullets. A single missing resource froze the most aggressive army in Europe. The open road to Germany closed, not with gunfire, but with empty fuel tanks. The moment passed. The Germans recovered just enough to fight again. The Siegfried Line would be manned. The Rhine would hold temporarily. And the war, which might have ended before winter, dragged on into months of blood, snow, and ruin for the men who stood idle at the front, watching the horizon and waiting for fuel that never came. It felt like something priceless had slipped through their fingers. The winning ticket had been in their hands, and then, suddenly, it was gone. Germany wasted nothing of the pause that saved it in September 1944. Every hour, every day bought by the sudden halt of the Allied advance was seized with ruthless urgency. What had begun as chaos was forced almost violently into order. The German war machine, battered and bleeding, did not heal. But it hardened. Men were rushed toward the western frontier in anything that could move. Training units were stripped bare. Recruits who had never fired a shot in anger were issued rifles and marched west. Sailors from the Kriegsmarine, whose ships no longer sailed, were pulled from ports and pressed into infantry roles. Luftwaffe ground cruise mechanics, clerks, airfield guards found themselves wearing army insignia and carrying weapons they barely knew how to use. Age and experience mattered less than availability. If a man could stand and aim, he was sent forward. The Siegfried Line, abandoned only weeks earlier, came alive. Bunkers that had stood empty were suddenly manned. Engineers worked around the clock to wire up firing ports, reinforce positions, and clear fields of fire. Artillery pieces, many old, some obsolete, were dragged into place and camouflaged. Minefields were laid hastily but densely, turning open ground into lethal traps. What had been a hollow facade in early September became by October a grim and functional defensive belt. At the same time, German headquarters began the painful work of rebuilding formations from wreckage. Panzer divisions, annihilated in Normandy and France, were reconstituted on paper first, then slowly in reality. Tanks trickled in from factories working under constant Allied bombing. Crews were patched together from survivors, replacements, and veterans pulled from training schools. Fuel remained scarce, training incomplete, and morale uneven, but formations once thought destroyed now existed again. They were not elite. They were not the battle-hardened divisions of 1940 or even 1942, but they were enough. By November 1944, Germany had managed to assemble nearly 30 divisions in the West. Many were Volksgrenadier units, lighter, less experienced, and poorly equipped compared to earlier German standards. Yet they filled the line. They held ground. They slowed Allied advances that once would have swept past them. Most critically, they gave Germany options. Enough to resist, enough to counterattack, enough to think not only of defense, but of offense. It was during this precious window of time that a dangerous idea took shape. If the Allies could be stalled, divided, or shocked, perhaps the war could still be altered. The Western Allies were advancing on a broad front, stretched and overconfident. Their supply lines were long, their assumptions firm. Germany's leaders began to believe that one powerful blow delivered at the right place, with surprise and concentration, might break that momentum. The result was the Ardennes offensive. The Battle of the Bulge was not born from desperation alone. It was not a last panicked gamble thrown together in chaos. It was a calculated plan prepared carefully behind a defensive screen that should never have existed. Divisions were secretly concentrated. Fuel was stockpiled in hidden depots. Routes were reconnoitered. Commanders rehearsed their roles in silence. None of this would have been possible without time. Time to rebuild shattered units, time to man defenses, time to plan an offensive that would catch the Allies completely off guard when German armor finally surged out of the Ardennes forests in December 1944. It shocked the world. The offensive cost Germany dearly and ultimately failed, but it prolonged the war, killed tens of thousands more, and forced the Allies into weeks of brutal winter fighting. All of it was made possible by that pause in September, a pause that had given Germany something it no longer deserved, time it should never have had. When Patton finally resumed his advance, the war he re-entered was no longer the one he had left behind. The brief moment of clarity and momentum that had defined the late summer of 1944 was gone. The landscape itself seemed to reflect the change. The long, bright days had faded. Autumn had arrived, and with it came relentless rain, low clouds, and mud that swallowed vehicles whole. Where Patton's columns had once raced across open roads, they now crawled forward through flooded fields and shattered towns. Progress was no longer measured in miles per day. It was measured in yards. German resistance, once brittle and disorganized, had stiffened. Newly formed units, poorly trained, but numerous occupied villages, forests, and ridgelines. The Siegfried Line, which had been an empty shell in September, now bit back with mines, artillery, and entrenched infantry. Every advance demanded preparation. Every crossing required engineers. Every village became a fight. Casualties rose accordingly. What had once been a pursuit became a grind. American infantry advanced under rain-soaked uniforms and constant shell fire. Tanks bogged down in mud or were funneled into narrow roads where ambush waited. Air superiority, so decisive in the summer, was blunted by weather that grounded aircraft for days at a time. The advantage the Allies had enjoyed slipped away, not because it was lost, but because it could no longer be used at the Rhine, the ultimate barrier to the heart of Germany stood ahead like a locked gate. In September 1944. That gate had been unguarded. Now it was fortified. The river would not be crossed until March 1945, 6 full months after it had first come within reach of Patton's spearheads. 6 months of additional fighting. 6 months of additional deaths. 6 months in which Germany, though doomed, continued to resist with growing desperation. Patton knew exactly what that delay had cost. He wrote about it openly, bitterly in his diaries and letters. He believed the opportunity had been real, fleeting, and irreversible. German commanders later confirmed his judgment. In post-war interrogations, many admitted that Germany could not have stopped a September crossing of the Rhine. The forces did not exist. The defenses were not ready. The reserves were a fantasy. Had the Third Army crossed the Rhine in September, the Western Front would have collapsed. Not bent. Collapsed. German armies in the West would have been cut off, surrounded, or dissolved entirely. Industrial regions would have fallen intact. Command structures would have unraveled under the shock. The psychological impact alone allied troops deep inside Germany before winter might have ended organized resistance outright. The war in Europe could have been over before Christmas. Instead, it dragged on. Winter came early and hard. December 1944 brought with it one of the bloodiest battles the U.S. Army would ever fight. The Ardennes offensive, the direct result of Germany's regained time, slammed into American lines with brutal force. Units were surprised, isolated, and surrounded. Fighting took place in forests choked with snow and ice, where evacuation of the wounded was often impossible. 80,000 Americans became casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. Alone. Killed. Wounded. Captured. Tens of thousands more soldiers, German, British, Canadian, and Allied, would die in the months that followed, fighting across the Rhine, through the Ruhr, and into the ruined cities of Germany. Civilians paid an even higher price as the war consumed what remained of the Reich. None of this changed the outcome. Germany still lost, but the cost was staggering. The pause in September 1944 did not save Germany. It merely extended its agony and multiplied the suffering on all sides. A war that might have ended swiftly instead became a drawn-out descent into winter battles, frozen corpses, and shattered towns, all because of time lost by the Allies. Time gained by Germany. Time measured not in hours or days, but in lives. German commanders were remarkably clear in their final judgment. When the war was over and the questions were asked in quiet rooms far from the battlefield, there was no attempt to rewrite history, no effort to claim genius where none existed. Again and again, their answers returned to the same uncomfortable truth: they were not saved by brilliance. They were not saved by strength. They were saved because the Americans stopped. The pause in September 1944 did not reverse Germany's defeat. Nothing could have done that by then. The factories were failing, the skies were dominated by Allied aircraft, and the Red Army was advancing relentlessly from the east. The Third Reich was doomed, but the pause did something. Else something far more personal and far more devastating. It changed who lived to see the end of the war. Because the Americans stopped, German defenses were rebuilt. Because those defenses existed, battles were fought that never needed to happen. Forests filled with the dead in the Ardennes. Towns were pulverized along the Rhine. Young men, many barely trained, some barely adults, were sent into combat only to be killed in fights that served no strategic purpose beyond delay for Allied soldiers. The cost was just as real. Tens of thousands who would have survived a September victory instead faced winter warfare, ambush and last-ditch counterattacks. They did not die for conquest or defeat, but for time lost, time regained, time wasted. In military history, time is often discussed like a resource, something abstract and strategic, measured in weeks or operational windows. But in 1944, that time was purchased with human lives. Every day bought by the pause carried a price paid in blood, suffering and grief on both sides of the line. That is the true legacy of September, not a debate about logistics or strategy, not a question of who was right or wrong, a human tragedy written in lives that should never have been spent.